Welcome to Two Doors Down. In honor of Halloween, deadlines. Deadlines are yet another facet in our podcast about time. They can feel like invisible forces shaping our time, priorities, and even our lives. How they push us forward and how sometimes they inspire us to discover what truly matters. What if deadlines were more than ending a project, but also developing character along the way? Can deadlines be lifelines?
Freddie Nelson struck a deal to remove discarded shipping pallets from a Lowe's home improvement store. Logan Gimbel and other security guards hired to patrol only the parking lots were unaffiliated with Lowe's. They confronted Freddie Nelson several times with antagonistic attitude, accusing him of unlawfully removing pallets, and eventually trespassed him from public areas. On May 29, 2021, Nelson and his wife arrived at Lowe's to go flower shopping when security guard Gimbel angrily ordered them to leave the property. In the video, Gimbel escalated the situation by initiating physical contact when he sprayed mace through a window of the pickup truck. Nelson was angry and flipped off the security guard. Gimbel stood in front of Nelson's truck while Nelson edged it forward. Gimbel then fatally shot Nelson through the windshield with a gun he was not licensed to carry. Nelson was hit 4 times in the head, shoulder, and chest and died on the scene. Nelson's wife filed a civil lawsuit against the owners of the property and the security company that hired Gimbel. The complaint alleges that security guards were told to look out for Nelson and to harass and intimidate him. A jury found Gimbel guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced him to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Chris, power corrupts every single time.
You know, there are a bunch of things about this story that are disturbing. And I sort of support authority in general, but I really feel like police officers, and more importantly, any guy that I'm going to call it, I know this is a derogatory kind of a term, but I'm going to call them rent-a-cops. That's what they are. These guys that he was ex-Air Force, and he thought that going and getting a job as a security guard for a parking lot at Lowe's would give him some sort of power, and I can just picture him doing the same thing that Robert De Niro did in Taxi Driver, where he was practicing in front of a mirror with a gun, saying, hold on, stop right there. I'm going to shoot. If you don't obey my orders, I'm going to shoot. And I could picture him doing that over and over again, getting ready for the awesome day that he would have this opportunity to confront a citizen
to
somewhere
finally
and
draw his gun,
draw it and pull the trigger.
Yeah,
which is what he winds up doing with this guy. This guy. For the record, this guy, the victim in this story, Freddie Nelson. So Freddie Nelson was no angel either. He was a drug addict himself, as we find out as we do some research later on.
But he did have a deal with Lowe's. The Lowe's manager asked him to come pick up these pallets, and she had been working with this security firm. She couldn't understand why they kept harassing him.
Yeah, and that's what it was. It was harassment. It really was harassment. So I just, I watched this video, and I watched it several times, and a lot of the video, it's all on YouTube, but a lot of the video has to do with, there's a number of observers, witnesses that pulled out their cameras and started videotaping what was going on, because it was escalating and loud, and there was arguing and so on and so forth, and then shots being fired.
And his wife was right there. I mean, could you imagine witnessing that? Your husband being shot and killed, and she was struggling to get inside the car because the doors had been locked, and it was just horrific.
The video, a lot of the video, it wasn't just that there were witnesses around. There was some of that in the video on YouTube, but most of the video was a body camera that the security guard had on
Mm-hmm.
him. And the security guard's behavior was just bizarre. I mean, some of the things, like he asked for the next day off.
Well,
a
right
vacation
after the
day.
shooting happened, the police had not even gotten there yet. And he called his office and asked for the next day off because he had to deal with the trauma of killing someone.
He had to think about what he'd just done.
Yeah.
And I mean, he was... there was something really off about the guy. And I feel like anybody that is in that position... where they, number one, he shouldn't have been carrying a gun, but if you are carrying a gun, whether it's legal or illegal to carry it, whether you're licensed or unlicensed to carry it, I think that somebody that's going to be in that position needs to have some sort of a psychological evaluation so that they whoever their employer is knows that this is not the type of person that's going to be quick to pull the trigger.
Right.
You know, you want to de-escalate as often as you can.
Well, and it sounds like this company that he worked for kind of encouraged their officers to be aggressive for some reason. So there's some internal memos that came out in the trial, and the whole thing was so unnecessary. It didn't need to happen. Even if he was stealing broken pallets, who cares? It's not worth getting killed over, but he wasn't even stealing them. The Lowe's manager asked him to please come get them.
But stealing or removing pallets, or however you want to describe what he was doing with the pallets, that goes both ways. It's not worthy for Gimbel to shoot this guy that was removing the pallets. It's ridiculous that he would shoot the guy because he was taking pallets. Or the other side of the coin is also true. Coming and getting the pallets when there's an unhinged, armed
officer,
security officer, security guard for the parking lot that has told you multiple times that, you know, I'm going to arrest you and I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that.
He threatened to arrest him several times. He said, "Turn around, you're under arrest." And he's like, and Nelson was like, "You can't arrest me."
Total disrespect for any authority, and just kind of, you know, he also, you know, Nelson carried mace with him as well. The victim, the guy that got shot, also carried mace with him, and they were antagonistic toward each other. It's almost like it was sort of a joke or a game that they were playing over months period of time that ended with the security guard finally deciding that, all right, I've had enough and I'm going to kill this guy no matter what happens. And then even afterwards on his own body camera, he says, you know, they're probably going to sympathize with the victim.
Yes, that's what he said.
And I thought how ironic that this guy, the security guard himself, would use the term victim to describe Nelson that had been shot in the car, rather than all the other ones. He could have used offender or perpetrator or suspect or any one of those other terms to describe the guy, but he called him a victim instead.
I think he knew immediately that he'd gone too far.
He'd messed up. He knew it.
Yeah.
I think everybody knows it.
Yeah.
When after you've pulled the trigger, it's too late.
It is too late. That's the danger in carrying a gun. If you can't control your temper, you get yourself in a lot of trouble. But, you know, Chris, that reminds me a little bit of prison correctional officers. I mean, there were some wonderful correctional officers that I met while I was in prison. Miss Johnston, Miss Williams. There were some of them who would just go out of their way to help you through a difficult spot.
Understanding and discipline, de-escalation, that they are empathetic.
Yes, but I would have to say the majority of correctional officers I encountered during my 27 months in prison, the majority of them were like Gimbel.
Assholes.
We always joked, you know, they don't have any power at home, so they take this job so they can feel powerful. And they just abuse it and use that power to just make other people feel bad or make their lives miserable. And I think that's where Gimbel was.
That Gimbel guy, he had a little bit of power. And he believed that he had it all. He felt that he was absolutely powerful.
Yes, when he just
you
had
could just tell by his attitude he was.
The biggest authority he had was to tell someone to leave or to call the police and have him arrested. But he thought he could do it all on his own. And it just turned into a, a tragedy, really.
In 1864, a prison. So 1864, for starters, that's the middle of the Civil War.
Oh,
So
yeah.
I don't know if you knew
Almost
that.
the end, but yeah.
Yeah, getting near the end. But 1864, a prison drew a line around the prison property, and any of the inmates that crossed the line would be shot. It was the deadline.
And it was the first time the word deadline was used that
Right.
anybody can find in history. So it's interesting that the first use of the word deadline truly meant that you're going to be dead if you cross the line, and it was related to a prison. So that's pretty appropriate to this podcast.
So we got that information from Webster's, who was, Webster was providing an explanation as to what the history of the term deadline came from. So I thought that was interesting. But I also find it fascinating that a deadline exists. So in this context, the deadline, this line that they drew around the prison, that it exists because real life circumstances also existed that made it effective. That without having prisoners inside the prison that have a desire to leave the prison, meaning that they're ready to escape, which I don't know if, have you ever heard of anybody escaping from prison?
No,
not
never
you.
have.
Not
No.
you. You've never done anything like that.
I've never escaped.
Never knew anything about it. But anyway, but the point is that prisoners in prison, all prisoners, I would think, no, maybe not all, but most prisoners, a heavy 90+% of prisoners are feeling like freedom tends to be the number one highest priority.
Yeah, their
that
goal.
In some cases, freedom is more important than life.
Yes.
That they're willing to risk crossing a dead line in order to obtain freedom. That they'd rather die than stay in prison any longer.
Right.
Which I think John Maynard personified that.
Yeah.
We'll get to that a little bit later. But so you're risking a deadline because you value freedom more than life itself. I think that's pretty powerful.
Well, and death really is the biggest deadline any of us have, I think.
Yeah, well, death or the end of life is really a deadline. It is the most natural, obvious deadline that all of us have, that we all have a deadline. We all have this situation, a circumstance that we're facing, that the time that we have left, and of course our podcast and this episode is about deadlines, but the podcast is about time. And time is something that has us all. We don't have, there's no way to get away from it.
Yeah, that's right. So Simon Sinek had a video about why, and it was so famous. Yeah,
I've seen that video 100 times.
It's
maybe
really what
200
catapulted him into being someone that is known.
And I am not exaggerating. I've seen it that many times.
Wow.
I've watched it over and over and over and over again. Now, I think it kind of interesting because when we pulled the deadlines card out of the basket on our last episode, indicating what this episode was going to be about, the very first thing that popped into my head is I couldn't remember exactly what the video was, but I remember it was a Simon Sinek video, and I knew that he was talking to a large crowd of people, and I remember that he was talking about Steve Jobs from Apple Computer, and that and it was fascinating because, as it turns out, I went and I found that video rather quickly, and it was Simon
the very
Sinek at
end
USI.
of the video.
And he spoke for an hour. The 1 hour video where he speaks at USI is phenomenal. You wouldn't believe it. Gives me goosebumps just thinking about how awesome the speech was. It was absolutely phenomenal. But as it pertains to this episode of our podcast, the last minute of the video, he is describing a number of different things, but one of the things that he mentions is about Steve Jobs.
Yeah, and he said, Steve Jobs has one thing that none of the other leaders have. He's dying. And he said that's the reason why he was such an amazing leader. Not because he's a genius, but because he's dying. He has nothing to lose. So he can go with any idea he has. And he went.
I thought it was cheeky the way that he ended that statement, and he says, he says that. Well, first off, is he says young people don't have any respect for risk.
Right.
They don't see any threats in front of them, so they're willing to say or do anything. And same as very old people realize they've already come to terms that they are about ready to pass. And when they're passing, they realize that they have nothing to lose, so they're willing to say or do anything.
Right.
And they don't care what anybody thinks. They don't care what Wall Street thinks. They don't care what their parents think. They don't care about anything. They just don't care. They'll just say whatever is on their mind.
Yeah.
Which I think is beautiful. It's sort of, I'll get to that in a minute, but so Steve Jobs, and he said the reason that Steve Jobs is such an amazing leader is not because he's a genius, but because he's dying. And then he goes on, and I thought the cheeky end of this thing, which is like the last 10 seconds of this 1 hour awesome video, he says, why do we get so much done the week before we go on holiday? And then this is Simon Sinek, and he says, it's because there's a deadline. A deadline. I never thought about that.
Yeah.
And that's pretty cool the way that he says that.
It is.
Because it really brings, not only does Simon Sinek, he's rife with so many fantastic things that have to do with business and philosophy and empathy and feelings and the motivations for market to purchase Apple phones or whatever it is that he's talking about. He has all these brilliant epiphanies, but he's always thought about those epiphanies and then brought them to a speech effectively for us. But then here he is on stage in a 1 hour speech, and at the end of the speech, he has yet another epiphany.
Yes, right on stage.
Right on stage, talking that he's
right.
like, wow, deadlines. I'd never thought about
That's
that.
right.
And he's relating that to Steve Jobs dying.
Yeah. So the question we really wanted to try to tackle with this episode is, can deadlines be lifelines? I think that's pretty powerful. And my mom, who was just the most wonderful woman in the world, was the pillar of my life. She's the reason I survived prison. I mean, she was just everything to me. And I was so blessed to realize it, for the last 10 years of her life. I wish I had realized it all the other years that I had her in my life. I could have taken so much more advantage of that. But my mom was sick for quite a few years. She had COPD and emphysema, and she just was frail. And she reached this point where her lungs were filling up with fluid, and she'd go into the hospital and they would drain her lungs, and then they'd fill back up, and then they'd drain them again, and they'd fill back up. And so the last time they drained them, they sent her to a nursing home right across the parking lot because they wanted her to have a little more medical care before she went home. And the doctors at the nursing home told us, there is no cure for this. Her lungs are just going to keep filling up, and we can keep draining them, but it's painful and it's pointless. Your mom is on her way out. And so we decided that we would take her out of the nursing home and bring her home so she could die at home, which is what she really wanted. And, Chris, you and I lived in Sedalia at the time, which was it was 100 miles away, an hour and a half drive or so. And the plan was that you were going to bring me to Kansas City, and I was going to stay at my mom's with her, once we brought her home. So it was a Sunday, and we went to the nursing home. She was going to come home on Monday, but we went to the nursing home to be with her, and she was watching a Chiefs game. My frail little mom, looking like she's hardly with us, and she's in the bed cheering the Chiefs on.
Your mom had such a deep character, and then she was such a principled person.
Yes.
And she saw things in black and white, and it was just, she was beautiful.
Yes,
she was just beautiful. She was an amazing person.
She was my everything.
And so she's actually laying in bed, and she's already accepted that this is a hospice situation. She knows
she's coming home to die. She knows that Monday morning they're going to check her out. They can't check her out on the weekend, and she's coming home to die. And she's cool with it. She's actually kind of excited about it, to be honest. And this guy walks in, and we're in the middle of the Chiefs game, and my mom was a die-hard Chiefs fan. So this guy walks in the middle of the Chiefs game, and he says, "Mrs. Phelan, I'm here to take you to physical therapy." And my mom looked over at him over the top of her glasses, and she said, "No, you're not. This is the Chiefs game." And he said, "Well, it's time for your physical therapy." And she said, "Do you know that tomorrow I'm going home to die?" And she said, "Do you know what that means?" And the man said, "No." And she said, "It means I don't have to do anything I don't want to do for the rest of my life. And I am not going to physical therapy." And
I'm going to sit here and watch the Chiefs.
I'm going to sit here and watch the Chiefs game. And tomorrow I'm going home to die.
Yeah.
That's my plan. And she meant it. And we took her home the next day, and the hospice nurse came, and we set up her hospital bed in her front room so she could look out her window and see her garden. And the hospice nurse came, and we were all there, the brothers and sisters, all of us were there, and I was staying there, actually. I was just gonna stay there 24 hours a day, but everybody else was gonna come and go, and we were gonna care for her till the end. And the hospice nurse called us all into the kitchen, into the other room, and of course we asked her, "How much time does mom have?" And she said, "Well, of course we can't tell you. We don't really know. Dying is an individual thing, and it is different for everyone. But I would say that she has no more than 10 days. And so, we thought, okay. And everybody else went on about doing their own thing. And I went into my mom's room, and she said, "Toby, I know you'll tell me. I know you'll be honest with me. What did that hospice nurse say? How long do I have?" And I started the whole, "Well, we don't know."
Beating around the bush.
Yeah. And my mom said, "No, she gave you a time. Now you tell me." And I said, "Okay, Mom." She said it could be up to 10 days. And my mom looked out the window, and she looked at me, and she looked out the window, and then she looked back at me, and she said, "Okay, that's a deal. I'll give you 10 days, but not 1 day longer." And true to her word, on the 10th day, she was gone.
She passed, yeah.
And, I think
what's interesting about this story is that partially there's a deadline that your mother was facing, but we all face that. It's the end of our life. So that's one thing. But the other part is, I feel like what she was stating at that time was she was providing you and the whole family with a deadline.
With
You've
10
got 10
days
days
to
with me.
Get okay with this.
Yeah, whatever you're going, if you have something that you need to get done while I'm still alive, then you've got 10 days to do it.
Yeah. Yep. And she said to me, my mom was an avid reader. I got it from her. But she looked at me, and she had a book laying next to her bed in the other room, and she said, "I guess I'll never know the end of my story." And I thought, "Oh my gosh, here's something I can do." And I said, "Mom, would you like me to read your book to you?" And she said, "Yes." And so I sat and read to her for 10 days, and I barely got finished the book. And I would think she wasn't listening to me. She was just laying there. She was not
dying.
Yeah. And then, I'd say something, and my mom would say, "Don't do it. Tell her not to do it." So I knew she was listening.
Responding to the
yes.
story, yeah.
And I've heard that sound and listening is the last sense that you lose.
So here's something that I pick up from this, and this is something that I feel is important, because there's a definition of deadline, which you could look up in Webster's dictionary, but I also think that there's this connotation, this purpose, this meaning behind it, and I'd like to discuss that a little bit, because it's relative to your mom dying or anybody dying.
Right.
And that is that there's such a thing, in my book, there's such a thing as a natural deadline, which is a very physical reality that at the end of this, the life of somebody is going to end. And when you're at that end, if you know that end is coming, you have a certain amount of time, and of course our podcast is all about time. You have a certain amount of time to achieve whatever it is that you need to achieve. And you don't have any there's no recourse. The end of this is going to end opportunity. So ending a life ends opportunity.
Yeah.
And I think that that's different than what we typically think of as a deadline. So like in corporate environments, you have a manager that says, hey, we have this product and we're going to roll it out and we have a deadline of January 1st. That's just this arbitrary, artificial line in the sand that they've drawn.
One of the most common things in corporate America when you set a deadline is the phrase, can we push the deadline? You know, people are always like, we can't make that deadline. Let's push it. Let's push it. Well, it's not a deadline then.
Then it's not a deadline.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an arbitrary, it's a goal.
Right.
And there's nothing wrong with in my book, it's nothing wrong with calling it a goal, but I don't think that they should throw the term deadline around so loosely.
Yeah, they've kind of depleted the meaning of it, I think.
In my book, it's sort of like, I think that the word promise is overused. So people use the word promise. And
all
they
the
throw
time,
it around everywhere.
superficially.
And I won't use promise unless I feel that it has a reverence, a deeper purpose and a meaning that is so critical that if I were to use the word promise, it means that I'm willing to die to make sure that it happens. Otherwise, I'll just tell you, yes, I'll do it, but I'm not going to say I promise I do it. You know, a promise is something that is more precious than that.
Yeah.
And so is a deadline.
Right.
I think it's precious.
I agree.
And it should be reserved for something that's a precious situation.
I love that idea. So, you know, I also had another deadline with my son, Greg. And after my inglorious prison escape, you know, my sons weren't too pleased with me. And so...
Wouldn't even talk to you.
No.
Disowned you.
Wouldn't talk to me at all. And I assumed I would have all the time in the world to work this out with them. And then... You know, Greg was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma, and things weren't going well for him. He had a bone marrow transplant, and it didn't work. And then he had a second bone marrow transplant from his brother.
I think it's interesting that you were released from prison. Mm-hmm. And in your life, being released from prison was a major event.
Yes.
Maybe one of the biggest events that you could ever possibly have in your lifetime was being released from prison. Mm-hmm. And so you have this major event. And at the same time, literally on the same day.
The very same day that I was released from prison, it was Greg's 24th birthday, which I thought was a good omen. But Greg was spending his 24th birthday in the hospital being diagnosed with this stage 4 aggressive cancer. Mm-hmm. And
literally, he had 1 year left to live. So he had a deadline.
17 days short of 1 year.
He had a real deadline, the natural deadline, the physical deadline that we were talking about that carries with it such a heavy consequence.
Right.
That you have to get, whatever it is that you're going to do in your lifetime, you know that you've got to get it done.
And so I thought I'd have this time, you know, give my sons some space, let them work through whatever they needed to work through, and we'd come back together. Well, I didn't have that time with Greg, and you know, I went to the hospital to visit him once, a couple weeks before he died. And then the day he was dying, you know, someone called my mom and told her that Greg was in a coma and he was dying. And you know, you said to me, Chris, Toby, let's go. You have to get to the hospital. You're his mother. This is it. This is all the time you have. You have to go. And so we went to the hospital, and I had to really fight quite a lot. The police were called. It was really a huge scene, but finally I was able to get into his room for a few minutes. I was allowed 15 seconds. And I walked into the room, you know, and I took Greg's hand and I leaned down and I whispered in his ear and I told him, Mom's here. You've done such a great job fighting this, and now it's okay to go, Greg. You're free to go. You don't have to fight anymore. And I left his room, and before I got to the elevator, he had died. I know he heard me, and I think that's what he was waiting for.
There's a bunch of things here that need to be addressed. Number one, Toby, dying was not the worst thing for Greg or your mom.
No.
It's the worst thing for you.
It's the worst thing for me.
Yeah. You're left here.
For all of us left behind, it's the worst.
As a survivor, having to deal with the pain of loss. And I get it. And I want you to know that I feel for you.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry that you had to experience that. But there's a few other things here too. You said that, Greg, you're free to go. And I think it's fascinating that when it comes to death, the only thing that's more important to somebody is freedom.
Yes.
That you'd rather die than to be locked up.
Yes. Isn't that the truth?
And Greg passed on because he was in a prison of his own with cancer.
Yes.
And he'd rather just go than to have to continue the sickness. Yeah.
And I've kind of come to an understanding of Greg's death since then. It's been, gosh, Chris, it's been 15 years, 16 years. It's been a long time. But I think we're all here for a purpose. And whatever Greg's purpose was, he accomplished it 13 days shy of being 25 years old. That makes him a winner. I'm 67. I'm still here, and God's still saying, you got more to do. You haven't done your thing yet. And I know maybe Greg was the winner. I don't know.
Yeah, and maybe all of us are a winner when we finally leave this mud ball. You're leaving all the pain behind, and maybe there's something sweeter on the other side. I choose to believe that there is something sweeter.
I do too.
But so this period of time where you have a deadline, and more importantly, when you know what the deadline is, when you've been diagnosed with something that's terminal, that can be pretty powerful and driving. And it's a place where you just simply don't care.
Yeah.
Steve Jobs didn't care about pride, appearance, reputation, loss. Those are all secondary issues. When you and I watched that video of A&I, 24 Hours in A&I, which is a British medical documentary series, and it's A&E. That's right, A&E.
It's an excellent series. It
Series.
really is about life. It's about life and people, and it's powerful. I highly recommend it. I think it's on Netflix.
And there was this one episode where this father had a son who had been hit by a car, and there was a real question as to whether the son was going to die, and the son was only like 10 or 12 years old. He was just a young kid. And his dad was so devastated by the trauma that he sat down on the floor next to the elevator in the hospital crying and sobbing, and he just didn't care what anybody thought of him, and nothing else mattered. That his son's life was on the line. And I just feel that that's such a powerful thing when a life is on the line, when somebody that you love, when they're at risk and their life is at risk. There are just a few things here that are more important than your own life or your own so that your sanity is at risk or your freedom is at risk. So any principles that are threatened, they're so motivational that you're willing to give up your life over it. It's fascinating. It's sort of like the Grim Reaper has our very best selves at the tip of his scythe. That we are willing to go to an extreme to get done what needs to get done when there's a life on the line. When there's something that's more important than living on the line.
Right.
So deadlines are meant to achieve, the artificial deadlines are meant to achieve a sense of life-ending bravery. So
life-ending bravery. I don't think there's anything more brave than those who face death.
I got it
boldly and acceptingly, and
I think it's interesting because the natural physical deadline of dying is the most driving force. But then there's a deadline, the corporate type of deadline, this artificial deadline is also pretty driving. It gets people to do things. But in my book, I think that where the bravest person is somebody that doesn't have a deadline and they still achieve.
Yes.
They're willing to risk whatever it is that they have on the line. They'll risk anything in order to achieve what they wanted to achieve, even without somebody telling them, if you don't do it, I'm going to take this away.
Right.
Some ultimatum, which, by the way, ultimatum and deadline are synonyms.
Yeah. Oh, really? Synonyms.
In Webster's.
Wow, that's interesting.
So,
synonyms. I wouldn't have thought of that. I've been given an ultimatum.
You have?
Yeah. By my family members who haven't accepted my past. And that ultimatum is they can love me again if I quit talking about my story. Does that sound like love?
Oh, that's a great question, because obviously the answer to that is no.
Yeah.
I mean, love is unconditional.
Yeah.
And any love that is conditional, you have to scratch your head and wonder, is that love?
No, I don't think so. I think it's control.
My mother gave me advice one time when I was I think I was 8. I was in 2nd grade. And I was living with my grandmother because my mom and dad were getting a divorce. And my mom had been drinking and was in a lot of trouble, and my mom's a felon too.
She's a felon, yeah.
Was a felon. Well, I
She's
suppose
gone.
she still is if she's
I guess she
gone.
is. They didn't pardon her.
Right. So she's still a felon even though she's passed. But she was also very, very principled. My mother was fantastic.
Yes, she was an awesome woman. I was blessed to have known her.
I went to school when I was in 2nd grade, and there was this kid that was bullying me. His name was Andy. I don't know his last name. I don't remember it. But Andy was bullying me, and he bullied me each day that we went to school. And when I went out to the playground on a recess, then he would come over and tease me and bug me and bully me and push me around.
Steal your hat.
Yeah, and do whatever. And I came home and I complained about it. And my mother said to me, I thought it was brilliant because it established something with me that has lasted to this day. And she said, maybe what you should do is I know this sounds kind of weird, counterintuitive. This is what she's telling me. She says, maybe what you should do is then invite Andy over to your place so that you can play after school. That maybe Andy just doesn't know how to be social with you, so he's bullying you. But maybe if you were to extend a friendship, an olive branch, that maybe you'll realize that Andy isn't quite the bully that you think that he is. And so I was like, well, my mother's pretty smart, so I'm going to give it a shot. And son of a gun, it's true. Andy came over to play, and we wound up being best friends.
Wow.
And the point here is that any circumstance that you're in can be viewed in a whole totally different way. You can change your perspective.
Yes.
And I feel like Gimbal at the start of this show, the
security
officer could have used a different perspective to see what the circumstances were and been able to handle it differently, and maybe had changed the whole outcome of the whole thing.
And he wouldn't be serving life in prison right now.
Yeah,
It's
and there wouldn't be
crazy.
a dead victim.
A dead victim,
Yeah,
right.
that's right. So, for the record, George Washington also, he said, I cannot tell a lie. I chopped down the cherry tree. And these are stories of character.
Yes.
That giants of character tend to sway toward sacrificing their own image and their own ego and everything in order to aspire to something larger, like freedom or honesty or fairness or conviction, whatever it is. These are all big
conviction. What a powerful word.
Yes, yeah. So all of those are awesome. And for the record, it's a myth. He didn't chop down a cherry tree.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I had to go look it up.
I'm happy for the cherry tree.
Yeah. And for George Washington for being so honest and being given all that credit when in reality he didn't chop down a cherry tree. So, let's see. So I have a personal story, and since we're talking about honesty, this is a sort of a tough one because I argued with myself over this, whether we were going to share this in this episode, but I've decided that I'm going to go ahead and be transparent.
Okay.
And several months ago, maybe 6 months ago,
we went to the eclipse.
And I had an event while I was, we had stopped for
that
a bathroom break.
Eclipse has been in like 3 or 4 episodes.
Well, eclipses are pretty
They're
good markers,
monumental,
aren't they?
Yeah.
Not only are they markers, but they're markers of time.
Oh, yes.
Time is what we're after, right? So anyway, so we stopped for a bathroom break, and I had this this episode, and it was pretty painful. I didn't do anything about it, and I haven't really done anything about it even still.
Well,
but
we went to the
have
doctor,
gone to the
but
doctor.
got some blood work done.
It took some time to get the doctor's appointment, and it took some time to get some word back. But now my doctor called the other day, and it was a pretty nerve-wracking thing when you're at work making reservations for U-Haul customers from home in your basement, and your wife comes in and tells you that you have to take a break because your doctor is going to call in 5 minutes and there's something important that needs to be discussed. And that's a pretty scary kind of a thing.
Yeah, that is a scary call
to hear. And so my doctor did call, and since then we've had a couple of different conversations about this. But
some
now,
more tests.
But now she tells me that the blood tests that they ran for me came back with high PSAs. And I have no idea what PSAs were, so I decided after the call with my doctor, I should have just asked her, but I felt funny about asking her for whatever reason, but I wound up going to the internet to find out what PSAs are, and they're markers for prostate cancer.
Mm-hmm. We have an appointment with a urologist in November. I mean, the VA is a great health system, but it is slow moving.
I don't feel bad. But you know, the big C, cancer, is something that affects an awful lot of people worldwide throughout all of history, I'm sure. I also, for the record, I looked it up and it said that the survival rate for prostate cancer is up over 90%, that you'd still be alive after 5 years.
Wow, excellent.
So evidently there's treatments that they can
I've heard that
through to fix.
Well, Chris, I promise I'll be here.
My problem is...
Promise, you get it?
Promise what?
I'll be here through it all.
You promise that you're going to be here?
Mm-hmm. Through it all.
Through it all. Okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
I'll let
whatever it brings.
I don't know that I'll promise that I'll be here, but we'll see.
Well, you can't
promise that.
I mean, I suppose I could get hit by a car and then I wouldn't be here. But if I have the power, the capability to be here, I will.
I have multiple symptoms, by the way.
Yes, you do.
And one of the things, I've got high blood pressure, I'm overweight, I've got a bunch of other things that are going on, but probably at the center of it all, diabetes.
Yeah, that's coming on too.
I haven't really been too concerned about it. I'm 58.
You'll be 58.
I'll be 58.
In December.
I'm glad you're keeping track of that time, because that's a time that I don't
keep track of it. I have to figure out how old I am and then subtract 11 years to know how old you are.
Okay, good.
So all I have to do is keep track of myself, and then I just subtract for everybody else.
Oh, I see. I was wondering, there must have been a trick for it.
Yeah.
All right. So anyway, I think that for starters, I must say that I've lived a full life.
Oh, yes, you have.
And I'm certainly okay with, if God decides that this is my last day and if this is my deadline, then so be it.
Yeah.
I'm ready to go.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I also hope that I can achieve everything that God would want me to achieve in the precious little bit of time that I have left.
Yeah.
But it is really driving me to recognize a deadline.
Yes.
I'm more aware of mortality today than I ever have been.
Yes.
I'm Steve Jobs in the making.
Yes. It definitely does have an impact. So...
by the way, I also wanted to mention in that same thought, that same thread, is that my own mortality and my own deadline is also inspiring me to not care about anything or anyone. Opinions.
Well, you care about me.
No, Toby, that's not what I mean. I care about you, and I care what you think of me. But you already know me, my most honest self.
Yes.
You already know that. And what I'm saying is that
you have nothing to lose. You're just...
I'm willing to say anything to anyone, including you. If there's something that I need to say, I have no problem with just being transparent about it. And
that's pretty powerful, and I think that's a blessing.
No, wait a second. The point I'm getting at is that you and I have already talked about this, and I know you get nervous about it, and you're already nervous right now. I can see it in your eyes. But the point is that politics is going to come into our podcast.
Yes.
It's coming.
Okay.
That's where this is going to go.
Okay.
And
well, not today.
Not today, but the election is coming in a week.
That's okay. We'll deal with it then.
You are just not ready to have that conversation.
Politics. No, I don't.
I know you don't.
I don't want any part of it.
All right, so here we are at our favorite part of the episode, felony murder. Not only is this part of our podcast inspired by John Maynard, in this episode, we're going to share his story.
Yes, so John Maynard is our felony murder story today, and I think that one of the best places to start really is in my book when I write about meeting Chris. And this actually, Chris is in this, when I meet Chris and he asked me about John Maynard. So in the car, Chris asked,
"Tell me more about John Maynard."
Facing Chris while he drove through the night, I continued my story. The day I met him, he walked boldly right up to me in the prison yard, unlike any other inmate. He stopped before me under a blazing sun. He offered his hand cordially. "I'm Maynard. I'd like to be your next handler." I squinted one eye hard shut and shaded my other with my left hand. With my right, I took his and shook firmly. I'd shaken a lot of inmates' hands, yet John was different. His silhouette seared my mind. For a shaving of a moment, I forgot to let go of his hand. Every bit of our first few seconds together transferred tons of chemistry. When I released his hand, he held his hand there in midair for a moment, as if to offer it a second chance, or perhaps to assert that he did not initiate the withdrawal. He intrigued me. When he spoke again, he jarred me awake. "You need me in the program because I'm good, really good. Probably the best dog handler in the prison." I liked his confidence. I liked his swagger. I liked him.
So, John Maynard, even right at the onset, character, charisma,
he stood apart. Yeah, he definitely had a presence. And it wasn't just me that noticed it. Even the people in the prison noticed. I mean, I would hear officers say, "Well, if you get John Maynard, or if you get Maynard on board, everybody else will be on board," because he kind of leads the yard.
So not just the officers and not just you, but me when I met him.
Yes, you met him in prison in New Hampshire.
And other inmates respected John Maynard.
Yes, they did.
And I don't think that the type of respect that he commanded was just this physical, "I'll kill you" or "I'll beat you up" or something if you don't obey what I...
Yeah, it really wasn't that. He just had this quiet authority, and people knew, don't mess with him.
Which is really, really nice. So it was a great way for him to carry, especially when you're in a prison. So it's not an easy thing to do.
That's right.
Anyway, so...
this is a little bit of information about this case.
This is another excerpt from
This is actually
Toby's book.
Part of the Wall Street Journal article, but it is reprinted in full in my book.
Right. So, we felt that this was a pretty good snapshot into some of the character of John Maynard and his story.
History of his crime.
So, yet Mr. Maynard suspected no amount of reform would ever win him freedom, he told Miss Young. At age 17, he'd received a life sentence for his role in a carjacking that left a passenger fatally shot. By Mr. Maynard's calculations, the earliest he would gain parole would be 2028, and he felt certain he wouldn't win it even then. His biggest fear, he says, was that he'd be buried on prison grounds. All this, he told Miss Young, for a crime he never committed. As an adolescent, he said he'd been a self-centered adrenaline junkie, and not because his parents hadn't taught him right from wrong. My life wasn't taken from me. I gave it away. by stealing the guy's car, he says. Yet he says he didn't shoot anybody. He hadn't even been carrying a gun, he says, asserting that his older accomplice accidentally pulled the trigger. I would never kill anyone, Mr. Maynard told her. Paul Morrison, the prosecutor in the case, says he believes that Mr. Maynard didn't pull the trigger, but he says that the felony murder law in Kansas renders that issue irrelevant because Mr. Maynard participated in a crime that clearly had a potential to turn violent. Prosecutors say felony murder, besides being a deterrent, avoids the legal gridlock that occurs when defendants endlessly point fingers at each other. Felony murder is a concept that many other nations and some American states have abolished as unfair. Going online, Ms. Young researched the subject and concluded Mr. Maynard had a point. If you didn't kill anybody, you shouldn't be convicted of murder and sent to prison for life, she says.
And that was my first introduction to felony murder. And I've learned so much more about it, as has Chris. And actually, Chris was the driving force behind making felony murder the center of this podcast. So
felony murder is, what is it?
It's a loophole.
It's a loophole. So it's a loophole. And I don't like loopholes. I don't like them because a loophole is favoritism. It is
getting something you don't deserve. And actually, Paul Morrison, the prosecutor, said it in there. They don't have to worry about convicting you. They can just grab anybody. So they don't have to deal with the defendants.
A loophole is something where everybody has a rule or a law, some standard that they have to live by, and a loophole provides some back door for somebody to get around that little standard that everybody else has to live by, and allows them to do something that the rest of us don't have that opportunity.
In this case, it allows them to convict lots of people of one murder. When one person did it, they can convict a whole handful of people for it without ever having to prove intent.
So the whole idea is throw everybody in jail.
That's right. That's
and
our
it's
policy.
just ridiculous.
It is ridiculous.
The whole thing is just, it's madness.
Yeah.
So we have, let's see, we're going to choose for next week's.
Yes, it's time to draw from our basket.
Okay, so this is our basket, and we're going to stir up our cards here and figure out what next week's topic is.
Pick a good one, Chris. Pick a good one. Pick a good one.
All right.
Don't pick a dumb one. You put the dumb ones in.
Decades.
Decades. Decades. I don't know. That's one of the dumb ones, but we'll see what we can do with it.
I don't think that's a dumb one. I think that's an excellent one.
Okay.
I think we'll be able to entertain lots of different things on that one. So
interesting.
Decades it is.
Okay. There we go. So, as we wrap up this episode of Two Doors Down, it's clear that deadlines are more than just dates circled on a calendar. They're milestones in the journey, moments that challenge us to rise to the occasion, reflect on our priorities, and embrace our potential. So next time a deadline approaches, consider it a chance to discover what lies within you, to see how you can grow, adapt, and persevere. Thank you for joining us, and remember, sometimes it's the pressure of time that inspires greater strength.
Share your own reflections and stories using hashtag 2DoorsDeadlines and join the conversation about how we can make the most of the time we're given. This is Christian and Toby Dorr reminding you to make an impact with the moment you have. 2 Doors Down. It's about time.
Subscribe on YouTube at 2 Doors Down. For exclusive content, check out our Patreon channel. We're actually going to give away the cards we're drawing out of the basket. Our website is twodoorsdown.com.
Until next time.